Hello everyone. It's been a while since I did a video. It's been a hot minute. Anyways, here I am at it again. So I did a video series a couple months ago on why I believe in a pre-trib rapture. And in those series I laid out reason after reason after reason why the rapture occurs before the tribulation. Now the question often comes up, is the rapture in the olivet discourse? There's a huge debate among that. Both pre-trib scholars and post-trib scholars debate. Some say yes, it is in there, and others say no, it is not in there. So in many pre-trib scholars, they look at the wrong places looking for a pre-trib rapture. One prophecy teacher used the analogy of fishing from the wrong pond. They're looking for the right doctrine, but they're looking in the wrong passages of Scripture for the right doctrine. Because there's many similarities, but similarity does not necessarily mean sameness. However, whenever I read the Olivet Discourse, looking for it, it appears to me that the rapture is in there. But then when I look at the context, it's not in there. And so a lot of people are confused about it. Anyways, today I'm going to look into the Olivet Discourse, and we're going to find out today if the rapture is in the Olivet Discourse or not. Now there are three accounts of the Olivet Discourse. There's Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Matthew and Mark are very close to the same. However, Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse has a lot of differences in it. And we're going to look at that. So, without further ado, let's take a look at it. Let's see if the rapture is indeed in the Olivet Discourse. We're going to start first of all with Matthew's account. We're going to look at Matthew's account, and then we're going to look at Luke's account. Mark's account is very close, very similar to Matthew's account, so we're not going to double back and look at both of those. We'll just look at Matthew 24, and we're going to look at Luke 21. Now, before we get into Matthew chapter 24, there's something you need to keep in mind. There are many interpretations of Matthew 24. I'm just going to go over the main interpretations. Interpretation number one, Matthew 24 is all historical. It's all preterist. It all happened in AD 70. That's the first way people interpret Matthew 24. The second way people interpret Matthew chapter 24 is it discusses the whole inter-Advent age, the age between Christ's first coming and Christ's second coming, and then it zeroes in on events right up to Christ's second coming. That's the second main interpretation of Matthew 24. Both pre-trib scholars and post-trib scholars, there's people on both sides who hold that interpretation. The third view of Matthew chapter 24 is what I call the generational view. Oh, there's a spider. Oh, hate spiders. I've always been scared of spiders. That's one of my fears. Anyways, the third is what I call the generational view. What I mean by that is Matthew 24 simply discusses the events of the final generation leading up to Christ's return. There's people on pre-trib and post-trib sides who hold to that view. And then the final view is Matthew 24 discusses the events of the 70th week and the second advent. Those are the main interpretations of Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to see which one of those is correct today too. Oh, there is one more interpretation of Matthew 24. That is, it starts out discussing the 70th week, and then later on in the chapter, Jesus pivots it to events prior to the rapture. Anyways, those are the main interpretations of Matthew chapter 24. So when we're discussing if the rapture is in the olivet discourse, you need to keep that in mind. All right. With that in mind, let's take a look at Matthew 24. See if the rapture is in there, and then we'll look at Luke chapter 21. We'll see if the rapture is in there. So we'll start with verse 1, Matthew 24, verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one here stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So there are three main questions here. Question number 1, when shall these things be? Referring to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Matthew chapter 24 does not answer that question. It just goes on to the final two questions. But Luke 21 covers that question. The second question is, what shall be the sign of thy coming, the second advent? And the third question, and of the end of the world. The word world here is eon, meaning a certain time period, meaning the consummation of this age in the beginning of the millennial kingdom. Those are the three questions that the disciples are asking him. So there's three questions. Jesus doesn't deal with the first question in Matthew 24, but he does in Luke 21. But he answers the other two questions here in Matthew 24. So let's continue. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye not be troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Okay, so now, if you go through verses 5 through 8, if you compare them with Revelation chapter 6, let's go there real quick. They match perfectly with the first of the four seals in Revelation 6. The first seal, we have the white horse, which is the Antichrist. Jesus says false Christ, false messiahs, the Antichrist being one of them. And then the second seal, we have the black horse. No, we have the red horse, which is war. Then we have the black horse, which is famine, inflation, food shortages, starvation and stuff. And then after that, we have the fourth seal. And I looked and beheld a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto him over a fourth part of the earth to kill, with sword, with hunger, and with death, and with the beast of the earth. So the chronology in Revelation chapter 6 matches perfectly with the first of the signs in Matthew chapter 24. So I believe Jesus is speaking of the beginning of the 70th week. And to further confirm that, look at verse 8. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now the sorrows is an old idiom for labor pains. Back in the ancient times, when a woman was starting to have labor pains, she was entering the time of her sorrows. Now this isn't the first place where labor pains is used to describe a certain time period. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 uses the same analogy here. 5 verses 3, For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So you see the analogy of travail upon a woman of child, speaking of that time period, meaning the time of Jacob's trouble. Jeremiah 30, talking about the time of Jacob's trouble, uses the same analogy. Let's go there real quick to Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah 30, starting with verse 6, I believe. Yeah, verse 6, okay. Ask ye now and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces shall be turned into paleness. So here we see that time being so awful, he compares it with a woman in travail. In verse 7 says, Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble. So all three places talk about it being so bad as comparing to labor pains. So all three places is talking about the 70th week, I believe. So I think we can safely conclude that Matthew chapter 24, verses 6 through 8, is speaking of the beginning of the 70th week. Because they all use the analogy of labor pains. And the signs here in Matthew 24 match up perfectly with the seals of Revelation 6 in the same chronological order even. And furthermore, let's go with verse 9. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then many shall be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. So here we see persecution, which matches perfectly with the sixth seal, line by line by line. Matthew 24 is matching up perfectly with Revelation 6. In three places, it's using the same analogy of birth pains or time of sorrows. So we can safely conclude that Matthew 24 starts out with the beginning of the 70th week. So far we don't see the rapture here. We see the 70th week. And then you go on with verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Which happens in the middle of the tribulation with the two angels flying in heaven preaching the everlasting gospel. And then you go on with verse 15, Matthew 24, speaking of the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. And then verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved, but for the elect's sake, being Israel, those days shall be shortened. So far in Matthew chapter 24, we have the three questions Jesus answers. He begins with the seal judgments. He begins with the beginning of the 70th week. Then he goes on to the middle of the 70th week. It's laid out plainly, and if you compare Scripture with Scripture, you can see that that is the case. But is the rapture in this passage? Let's continue. In 26, he goes on to speak about the second advent. Whether if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered. So you see, again, clearly, you see the second advent. Let's continue. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. This is not to be confused with the sixth seal of Revelation chapter 6. That's a different event. How do I know it's a different event? Because with the sixth seal in Revelation chapter 6, people hide in the ground. They cry out for the rocks to fall out upon us, and they beg to be hidden from the wrath of the Lamb. But at the second advent, it says all the nations go out and fight him. So there are similarities, but these are different events. So what we have here is we have the second advent. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the earth to another. So the disciples ask the questions, and Jesus goes on to answer them with the judgments of Revelation. So Matthew chapter 24, beginning with verse 4, is speaking of the 70th week. And then we go on to verse 32. This is where it gets a little tricky. This is what threw me off. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So right here we have the parable of the fig tree. And once again, this is another one of those passages that have a ton of interpretations. One interpretation is the fig tree represents the nation of Israel, and when you see Israel gathered as a nation, that generation shall not pass away. He will come within that generation. And then people will go to Psalm chapter 90 saying a generation is 70 years, or but by reason of strength, 80 years. Which means that within 80 years of 1948, all the things spoken of would have had to happen. Which means the second advent would have to happen by 2028. Well, it is right now late 2022, and with the 7-year tribulation, the second advent can't happen until at least 2029. So that's one interpretation, meaning that it's a generation that sees Israel rebirth. Another interpretation is the word generation is a type of people, kind of like the generation that seeks the Lord, or this wicked and perverse generation, generation can be used in that sense as well. My personal belief on this passage, and I could be wrong, and time's going to prove me wrong, and it's going to prove me wrong very quickly if I am mistaken. When he says this generation shall not pass, he's not talking about a 70 or 80 as in Psalm 90 or even necessarily 110 or whatever. I believe the fig tree does indeed represent the nation of Israel, and when it says the generation shall not pass away, he's simply saying that there's going to be people alive who are alive in 1948 who will be alive when the second advent occurs. That's my personal belief on that passage, but I could be wrong. But that doesn't have anything to do with the rapture being in Matthew chapter 24, so let's get back to the topic at hand. So in Matthew 24, the disciples asked him 3 questions. One, when will the destruction of the temple be? The second is, what's the sign of his second advent? And then the sign of the end of the age, or the beginning of the millennial kingdom, or that dispensation or whatever. And then Jesus answers them. He lists events that's going to happen during the 70th week. And then he goes on, he mentions the second advent. And then he explains the nearness of his, how you will know when it's near, explaining the fig tree. So let's go with verse 36, because this is where a lot of people get the rapture, is in these following passages where it said right there is the rapture. So let's read these and see if it is indeed the rapture or not. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days they were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until that day Noah entered the ark, and knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. So also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall 2 be in the field, the one shall be taken, and the other left. 2 women shall be grinding at the mill. The one shall be taken, and the other left. Watch ye therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. So a lot of preacher people will say, aha, there it is right there. It says 2 will be taken, 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken, and the other left. That's the rapture, obviously. No, it is not the rapture. Now, at the time of the rapture, 1 will indeed be taken and 1 will be left. That is true. There will be 1 taken and there will be some left. But that's not the event he's talking about here, because in Luke chapter 17, the disciples ask where, and Jesus says, wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered. That's a reference to Armageddon and the eagles and the birds of prey coming to feast on the great and mighty men with the supper of the great God in Revelation 19. He's not talking about the Father's house, so that's not the rapture. Another verse that pre-trib people will use to say, aha, there's the rapture right there, is verse 36. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And people will say, well, the tribulation is 7 years. There's 1,260 days from the confirmation of the covenant. Therefore, people can know the second coming. Therefore, this has to be a completely different time. There's a known day and an unknown day. So there you have it. He has to be speaking of the rapture right here. Well, he's not speaking of the rapture because, number one, he says, but of that day and hour. That day, a specific time, referring to what he was talking about earlier, and he was talking about the 70th week and the second advent. So he clearly cannot be talking about the rapture because that is not in the context. Jesus was talking about the 70th week, the abomination of desolation, and he was talking about the second advent. He's saying, but of that day, referring to a previous discussion. So it can't be. And furthermore, it says, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. It doesn't say no man will know the day of the hour. He says, knoweth no man. Now there's a couple of ways to interpret this. Number one, that day and hour knoweth no man is a Hebrew idiom of the Feast of Trumpets. So Jesus could be referring to Rosh Hashanah in this passage. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But another interpretation, another way to look at it, is those days will be shortened. It's going to be 7 years, but the days are going to be shorter. There's going to be all kinds of solar flares, the sun going dark. People aren't going to know exactly what day it is. They'll have a general idea, but they won't know exactly what day. And when Jesus wrote this, he was in his glorified state, yet he was a man walking the face of the earth. True, he was God manifest in the flesh, but he wasn't in his full deity at this time, if that makes sense. He was deity, he was and is, he always will be the eternal God, but when he made this passage, he was fully man. He was in his humanity at this time, before he was glorified. And this is Old Testament doctrine here. He hadn't risen from the dead yet. So this verse, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. There's many ways you can interpret this. He's not just talking about a known day and an unknown day. So this is not the rapture. And then we go to verses 38 and 39. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and given in marriage until they enter the ark, etc., etc., etc. So preacher people will say, aha, you see, that's life is normal. By the end of the tribulation, with all the judgments going, a third of humanity killed by one plague, many people wiped out by all these others, there's not going to be life is normal. People are going to be doing everything they can do to survive. So he can't be talking about the second advent. He has to be talking about the rapture here. Well, Jesus is not referring to it's going to be life as normal. When he says eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, he's talking about people just having disregard for the laws of God, disregard for the coming of Christ. He's talking about people in a state of unpreparedness, not people just living life as normal and merriment. So, here in Matthew chapter 24, we do not see a rapture. What about Luke chapter 21? Let's go there. Let's go to Luke chapter 21. So when people say, is the rapture in the olivet discourse? Well, it's not in Matthew chapter 24. But let's look at Luke chapter 21. Because Luke chapter 21 is a lot different than Matthew chapter 24. So, let's begin with verse 7. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? And he said, Take heed that ye not be deceived, for many shall come. Here he's saying the same things in Matthew 24. Nation shall rise against nation, earthquakes, etc. But in verse 12 it says, Before all these things they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you. Settle it therefore, do not meditate before what ye shall answer. That's in verse 14. For I will give you a mouth. In patience possess ye results. But when we go to verse 20, read this. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation therefore is nigh. So here he's answering the first question. When shall these things be, the destruction of the temple? Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let them not which are in the countries enter thereto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all these things which are written may be fulfilled. Look at verse 24. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down until the time of the Gentiles complete. So right here, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's talking about them falling by the sword. And here he's talking about the destruction of the temple. And then he goes on again, talks about the second advent. And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and the stars, upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, and the sea and the waves roaring. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And these things begin to come to pass. And look up and lift your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. So in Luke's account, it's a little different. Luke's account, he's talking about the whole inter-Advent age, including the church age. Take a look at verse 34. And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that day comes upon you unaware. For as a snare shall it come upon all them that dwell upon the face of the earth. He's talking about the 70th week here. Watch ye therefore and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. So right here, he's speaking of the rapture. He's speaking of them escaping all of these things. It is not just the Jews escaping the second half of the tribulation when they flee to the wilderness. Here he's talking about escaping all these things. The Jews don't escape all of these things. They only escape the second half. So Matthew chapter 24 is all about the 70th week and the second advent, written to the Jews. Luke 21 talks about the whole inter-advent age, the destruction of Jerusalem, the time of wrath, being led captive to all nations, which happened until 1948. Because when it says there shall be great distress and wrath upon this people, that wrath upon that people is still occurring today. It's going to continue until the second advent, when the Jews recognize their Messiah. So here he's talking about the whole inter-advent age in Luke's account. And here he's making references to the rapture. Now remember, there's a difference between the Bible teaching the rapture and making an allusion to the rapture. The rapture of the church was not taught until Jesus in John chapter 14 in the upper room discourse. And it was taught then, but it wasn't fully revealed until the Apostle Paul. So the rapture was not taught until then, but there are allusions to the rapture in both the Old Testament and the Gospels. Matthew is not one of them. So is the rapture in the olivet discourse? Yes, it's in Luke's account. It's not in Matthew 24, but it is in Luke 21. I hope that answers some questions. If you have any questions or leave a comment, tell me what you think. I'm not very dogmatic, but when I read how Matthew chapter 24 lines up with the seals, when I read the analogy of birth pains and times of sorrows, how every time it's used in the Bible it's referring to the 70th week. When I read that Matthew chapter 24 and these, I can only come to the conclusion that the rapture is not in Matthew 24, but I do believe it is in Luke 21. Now that's it. That's going to be it for this video. God bless.